Avis, who comes to us from the Association of College and Research Libraries. Mary Ellen will be moderating today's session and welcoming our presenters. Welcome, Mary Ellen.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And I'm going to rely on the chat box if there's any trouble with any of you hearing me. I just wanted to remind everybody that we're in the second part of the two-part pilot webinar that is brought to you by the Coalition to Advance Learning in Archives, Libraries, and Museums. And I know that many of you have heard about the Coalition at the first webinar, so I just wanted to do a quick recap and to thank our sponsors. The work of the Coalition is made possible by the Institute for Museum and Library Services, IMLS, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. OCLC is a project partner and is convening the Coalition and volunteered its web platform to host these pilot webinars. There are 22 formal members of the Coalition that represent organizations that serve libraries, archives, and museums, and you will see them listed here. And of course, there's more information about the Coalition on the Coalition website, advancedlearning.org, and I think that Jennifer has it posted up there in the chat box. And as she had mentioned, the Twitter followers can use hashtag LAM Coalition to follow the work. Now, before we begin today's presentation, I just want to encourage you to use the chat box, as I've been doing, to ask you about where you're from and the weather so that you can meet each other, engage with the topic and with each other, and ask questions of the speakers. I will be watching that chat box. So now I'd like to turn it over to Bob Horton, Associate Director, and Sarah Fuller, Program Specialist from IMLS, to talk to us about evaluating your project plan.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for this second part. This is Sarah Fuller talking. Bob will be discussing some stuff later. We're moving very quickly through the introduction, but just to give you a sense for what we'll be covering today, we're going to do a quick recap of some of the feedback that we got from the first webinar. We'd like to thank everybody who actually submitted the surveys and gave us some good assessment material to work with. And then we'll be launching into going over some examples of the worksheets that you all submitted and some of the common trends and questions that we saw. And we'll be leaving some time throughout and also at the end for you all to ask questions. If you do have any questions, please feel free to use the chat box. We'll try to capture most of that and respond accordingly. So just so you all are reminded of what the Coalition's goals are for these two webinars, it is a prototype. I'm not going to go over this. One of the things we heard actually from your evaluation of the first webinar was that we spent far too long talking about the Coalition and introducing the materials, so we're definitely not going to be doing that today. But I did want to go over some of the feedback that we got from the last time, just to catch you all up on where we're approaching today's webinar. There was a very diverse group of participants who signed up for the first webinar, and due to that, we actually began with a very, very basic introduction to project planning. For the second one, we hope to get into some more detail and go over some examples that will hopefully give you all some ideas for your own projects that you have coming up. We'd like to thank everyone who did submit their surveys. Overall, the feedback we got was actually very positive. 86% of those who responded said they would recommend the course to others, but there were a lot of specific suggestions about what we could include and what we shouldn't include if we do run a similar webinar or course again. As I mentioned, you all said loud and clear that you wanted less introduction, but you wanted more details, more specifics. You wanted us to go into project management software, for example. This isn't something that we can necessarily do with the 1 hour that we had, and especially given the diverse group, but we do hear that, and that will make it easier for us in the future if we use this prototype to gear it to specific audiences. We're also hoping that this second part will help you to flesh out some of the things that you didn't necessarily hear about in the first. One thing I did want to mention, we heard from a lot of you that you felt like the first the first course was more of a grant writing workshop and less of a project management workshop. While we did hear you, and certainly that definitely reflects Bob and I, our current perspective at IMLS, something I wanted to suggest to many of you is that when you are writing a grant, it's important to actually approach it like it is a planning process. Project planning and grant writing are very similar. You're basically laying out the same foundations in both, and so hopefully with that lens, it becomes a little bit more clear for how we approach things in our first go at this. Anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Bob to talk about some of the more specifics of the worksheets that we got back.
Thank you, Sarah. And what I can say in general is that we had over 50 worksheets submitted from a wide variety of institutions, and some of those represented groups that were working together as well. So a tremendous amount of effort went into this, and we're very grateful for your engagement and participation. I would say just like the children in Lake Wobegon, they were all well above average. We were very impressed with the material. We thought the ideas for projects were excellent. We thought these were very well written, and we responded to all of them, except one we actually received just about an hour ago. I'll get to that one later, but all the rest of them we have sent comments, and in some cases have had some ongoing dialogue with the people who sent those in. I would say that the audiences for most all of these were very well described, and the audiences were aligned with projects aiming to meet tangible, identified needs. Because of that, our reviews, our comments, tended to look ahead. We brought up issues to address. We thought about some models that might be out there to study. We tried to identify some challenges that might be on the horizon. Some other high-level generalizations. There were not many common themes. So I can say, again, at a very high level, that there was often an underestimation of the need for outreach and communication. So in a lot of our comments, we would point out that, say, creating a product or service and getting people to use it are two very different things. That's why we have advertising. It's especially important to understand that, I think, because understanding the need for outreach means examining not just your audience, but your audience's demand for your products and services. Supply is not the same as demand. And that came up in a lot of the projects that mentioned digitization of various resources for various reasons. A couple of general comments in those areas. One, we always recommended that you create a very well-designed, well-thought-out, and well-documented workflow, because that was going to give you a very realistic idea of your capacity to manage all the aspects of the digitization process. It's not just a question of having a scanner and some free time with your staff. You have to define metadata standards, and that becomes a question of how much metadata, what kind of metadata. You have to look at quality control processes. You have to start estimating production rates so you can start timing your work and understanding schedules. You have to think about formats. You have to think about preservation. You have to think about access tools and so on. Because of all that work, I almost always suggested outsourcing whatever you can. And if you do that, the workflow document is going to be the basis of your RFP and contract. It'll help you manage your vendor or your partner more effectively. In my experience, nothing is more expensive than retrospective corrections, so you want to do things right the first time. And if you don't outsource the work, the workflow document will still be the key to managing your project. So again, be rigorous when you think about the demand for what you digitize. Digitization will make collections more accessible, and with the right tools, they'll make them more useful. But digitization doesn't guarantee that anyone will actually want to use that collection. I speak from experience. You can contact me offline if you'd like to hear about my 4 years working with the Governor Ventura collection, and I'd be happy to tell you all that went right and what went wrong with that. But the key problem was demand. We greatly overestimated the demand for those collections, and accordingly didn't have a very good alignment of costs and benefits. So if you are making a case for investment from your management, you want to be sure that costs of your project don't outweigh the benefits. But anyway, enough of the generalizations. All that we heard from you through the registration survey and evaluation expressed an interest in specifics. So let's look closely at a selection of the worksheets submitted. And I stress that all those I mentioned in the course of this presentation agreed to are discussing them in the webinar. One actually suggested that we not identify the organization, but otherwise they're all there, and the worksheets are available as Mary Ellen and Jennifer mentioned. So let's move forward. The first one I want to talk about is from Kentucky Horse Park, and I thank them all very much for sending this along. Again, you can follow these if you are downloading the project worksheets. I'm going to talk selectively about the description and the audience, and then the comments. At the end of each example, we'll ask, Mary Ellen will allow for some question and answer that she'll moderate. And I certainly urge any of you who are listening who submitted these to jump right in and tell us more about what you've thought and what you've done with this. Thank you. So anyway, Kentucky Horse Park. From the project description, assess the care and storage of the rapidly expanding audiovisual collection in preparation for rehousing, media transfer, and digitization. Learn what types of media are contained within the existing AAV collection and the best way to preserve them. The worksheet goes on to point out that the purpose of the project is assessment, and that the ultimate goals are going to be preservation and access, making sure that the collection is going to be available over time, and making sure that the collection is available for a wide variety of users. And the audiences that were identified, primary audience were lifelong learners, Kentucky Horse Park visitors, Kentucky Horse Park staff, and to a certain extent these are the general general visitors to the horse park. And the secondary audience were horse breeders, horse owners, equine scholars, equine organizations, and scientists. The constituency was pretty much, as you might expect, largely the staff of the organization and fellow archivists who could help with the development of a plan. So how did we respond? Basically, I thought it was a really, really good proposal. In a sense, this was sort of like planning for the plan, and the emphasis was on creating an inventory which was going to give the Kentucky Horse Park the scope and scale of the project they'd ultimately like the idea, or they'd ultimately like to do. What would need to be teased out, I thought, were a number of different tasks. There's the inventory of what's in the collection, and that would have to be, I think, a question of identifying not only what the content was, but the format, the medium, et cetera, things that will give a better idea of what the digitization challenges or opportunities are going to be, what ultimate costs are coming down the line. There's also a bit of research in there in the sense that you'd have to learn more about your options, what models are out there, who else is managing audiovisual collections, how are they dealing with providing access, how are they dealing with preservation. And because it is a technology project, and again, this is something we suggested in virtually every case, was that another responsibility or another task would be to try to identify partners, because when you mention digitization and all that implies, collaboration is, I think, extraordinarily important to examine. Nobody, in our experience, has all the technological capacity that they need. Given what we want to do, what our patrons expect us to be able to do, collaboration is really essential to coming up with a manageable, practical, cost-effective proposal. So this I think was really good example because it spelled out these options very, very well. The other thing I suggested that they consider was that they understand the distinction that their audiences were going to have in terms of the use value of the collection. And the reason why I would suggest that they become more specific about that, because that first set of audiences could be satisfied with something like a greatest hits approach. It could mean that the material that goes on into an exhibit or that was simply trying to demonstrate the value of the collection, or would appeal to visitors who are spending a fairly brief amount of time either at the website or at the site itself, the horse park itself. They may want just a small number of things. They may want some video that gives them an experience and an understanding, a kind of a microcosmic view of the Kentucky Horse Park. Horse breeders, horse owners, equine scholars, etc., scientists might have some very different interests, in which case the goal might be some critical mass of digitized content in a structured format, which allows for some kind of special subject-specific research tools that would, say, use all of the content in some sort of batch format. So understanding those differences and then understanding what implications they may have in terms of budgets and funding, I think is really, really important. In our own experience, we found that a large audience doesn't necessarily mean the prospects for funding are going to be really fantastic. In some cases, very small audiences with very specific needs can have access to some significant sources of funds, and designing a project around their expectations and their demand can often be the most and the most successful way of finding funding and support.
I think also teasing out what Bob said earlier about really developing the work plan is worth underscoring. We see a lot of the times that a lot of time is spent addressing or describing the need, describing the problem. It's easier to identify the problem than it is to necessarily fix the problem, and spending most of your time actually developing a work plan, even if it is very specific or targeted, will give you a better outcome.
Right. Yes, thank you. And the last thing we just sort of emphasize again is look for partners in these things. Preservation is increasingly a specialized activity, and the possibilities of finding partners who can do preservation for you is good. Digitization, especially as if you're looking at resources that cover a whole variety of different formats, is something that could really also benefit from outsourcing or partnering, because you don't want to make that big investment in overhead and software and hardware necessarily yourself. And last, again, access can often be very specialized. Different audiences want different tools and different functions. So having the right partners can greatly lower your costs at the same time as it would increase the accessibility and usefulness of your resources. So this was, I think, a really, really good example of a well-thought-out project that raised a lot of really interesting questions, and I'm very grateful for the Kentucky Horse Park for sending it to us. And then I'll hand this over to Mary Ellen if she has noticed any Q&A, and especially if anyone from the horse park is online and would like to send a note to us via chat, that would be great.
Hi, Bob and Sarah. So far, we haven't had any questions, and I just prompted the chat box, but I think people found it helpful to hear the specific kinds of things you suggested, such as finding those right partners and the fact that the size of the audience wasn't necessarily relevant to the size of funding people could request.
So we'll give it one more sense. But again, thank you very much for the staff at the Kentucky Horse Park for sending us this. So it was a really, really good example, really excellent project, and we wish you all success with it. So the next one we have is from the Historical Society of Long Beach. And the description of the project is develop and implement a new volunteer management policy, including service descriptions, interview procedures, updated orientation materials, updated training materials, updated volunteer applications, and volunteer evaluations. And the purpose of the project was essentially to standardize these processes and forms and policies, basically to allow for much better management and better use of benefits from the Volunteer Services Program. And that's, I think, a very interesting project and one that most everybody can benefit from, because virtually everybody is looking at the possibility of using volunteers. The audiences excuse me, were described with in this way. The staff who are immediately going to benefit from the project, the streamlined training that will benefit new and existing volunteers, and researchers will have better access to a more complete database. And in our comments, what we said was it's an extremely important topic for the reasons I just mentioned, that the volunteers are increasingly a big part of our lives in the cultural heritage world, and so having an understanding of standardization, any process that will help managing volunteers, and providing, I should say, benefits to the volunteers, because really it is something that we want to be a mutually beneficial experience, would be very important. One thing I noted, though, was that there was a difference in the general aspect, and I'll move back to that page, very general aspect of the description of the project, which talked about volunteers in general. And then in the audiences, especially under number 3, a very specific reference to researchers as people who are going to be benefiting from this. So one thing I thought was good to be very, very clear about what would be the focus of the project. And again, this is something, as Sarah was just saying, that the more you work out, the better better options and opportunities, the likelihood of success will be, because you will have thought out all your concerns, all your issues, and crossed your T's and dotted your I's, as they say. But in this case, if the focus is really going to be on people who are just volunteering to work on the libraries for specific functions, then that's a very different and smaller project than the much more generalized one that was described in the project description. So if that really is going to be the priority, then it would be considerably simpler and more focused activities to keep in mind and work out. So as general, as we always mention, we said, please take a look at other models. I'm sure that there are other models and programs in institutions nearby that could lend advice about the ways to do this, and certainly there are probably examples about certainly examples and materials about training volunteers and managing volunteers. The other thing I stressed was that volunteers can play multiple roles within an organization, and that we generally can think of them in one way as simply doing some things that we ordinarily wouldn't do. And there are plenty of examples of that. But as I said, volunteers in an ideal world are getting something from their experience, and that it's a mutually beneficial relationship. And that's, I think, something that to keep in mind, because you have to, as a staff, as an organization, give something to your volunteers. It's a two-way street. And one thing you may consider as well is that volunteers very often become members of organizations and ultimately donors to organizations. So that investment on your side can be beneficial in a number of ways, and very often development offices are closely involved in volunteer organizations. So if that's a consideration in Long Beach, then the development office might want to get involved in this. They might want to help support the range and development of volunteer opportunities, just so that more people can play a part in a larger part in the organization.
I would also just mention, in terms of the benefits of getting your volunteers more deeply involved with your staff, when developing a management policy like this, volunteers can be also a great source for community engagement, for finding out other audiences or groups that perhaps you want to work with or haven't necessarily tapped into in your community, which is something we had discussed last webinar. So just to keep that in mind as well.
Right. So we'll hand it over to Mary Ellen and any questions that may come up.
Hi, Bob. Thank you. Yes, we have a couple questions. Lori would like to know, she said she had heard that, there's some things you can't ask for, like overhead. You can't ask for funding for overhead, and this whole volunteer program sounds like an overhead thing. So could you talk a little bit about why this would be appropriate for funding and not just be seen as overhead?
I'm not sure funding from IMLS. I'm not sure what.
She didn't specify. Lori, do you have any more you want to add? If you do, please put it in the chat box. But I think in terms of funding, there's a general perception, because I've heard it too, that funders don't fund overhead and not necessarily limited to IMLS or attributed to IMLS, but that they don't want to support those ongoing operations.
Right, exactly, and I think perhaps that's a term has more resonance for me. Is that generally funders don't like to support operations. So if you're in a position where you can find someone who will help your general operation, your general operating funds, that's fantastic. But for the most part, funders, in my experience, are looking for specific projects, increasingly with specific outcomes. And I know that when I was at the Minnesota Historical Society, over the course of the 15 years I was there, the number of people who were giving us money as general operating funds decreased, and the number of people who were saying, we'll give you money to work with these audiences for these purposes that meet our foundation's needs or our corporation's expectations greatly increased. So finding understanding that change over time is I think, made a big difference in everybody's budgets.
Thank you. One other question we had was, and this may have been posted more to the group, but if you or Sarah have any thoughts, was suggestions for how you handle project management when the project manager leaves midway through the project.
Dun, dun, dun.
Sarah made the noise. That's something that happens in a lot of projects, and turnover is really, it's a sad fact of life. What we find very often in the projects funded by IMLS is that an organization is hiring a project manager specifically for that project on a 1, 2, or 3 year basis, and it's almost inevitable that someone hired on that basis is going to spend time looking for other positions. You can't deny that, and you certainly can't blame anyone for that because it's a tenuous existence. So I think the fallback, the default, how you protect yourself is to have a really well thought out plan.
And well documented.
Yes, extremely well documented, because what you lose when someone exits as a project manager is that institutional memory. And if things have been done on an ad hoc basis, if things have been done without the documentation, as Sarah mentioned, then you're really up the creek without a paddle. So I think having that plan and having a group of people involved in the management and oversight of the project is the safest thing you can do.
I think also, it's not even just the project manager. You can lose a partner. You can lose one of your key staff members. We've all seen that happen. So, yeah, I think the communication is absolutely key. And this might also be something that we should kick back to the chat box. If anybody else has some specific stories about losing a key staff member, project manager, or any strategies for dealing with that, that would be a great input for us to have.
Yeah, Celeste just posted a nice comment there, similar to what you all were saying. She built a second into each project, so that it also covered for vacation time or other leave times. There was always somebody else that could be knowledgeable and keep the project running.
Great.
And the participants have also been exchanging good ideas about how they manage their digitization and manage their volunteers, but I don't see any other specific questions at the moment.
Okay, well, we will move on then. So this is the proposal, or the worksheet we received, where the person who wrote it said we could use it as an example but didn't want the organization identified. So there is no copy of the worksheet, and this has been slightly edited for purposes of anonymity. So describe the project. The library will host a Wikipedia edit-a-thon to invite members of the Wikipedia scholarly and film fan communities to update and create Wikipedia pages on film-related topics. The edit-a-thon will use the library's resources and will take place on a weekend afternoon in the reading room. And then we have for the audiences, 1, Wikipedia contributors interested in the library, 2, fans and scholars likely to use Wikipedia, and 3, library director, library manager, systems librarian, IT, reference, and other library staff, security staff. And we thought this was a very, very well-written, very clear proposal, and it obviously understood the implications of this project. and the references included in the whole worksheet indicated that the person was aware of similar types of activities. So she's been doing some of the necessary research to make this work. One thing I'll mention, and please let her know that I mentioned her, is that Marilee Profit from OCLC Research has over the past few years done a tremendous amount of work in this area and encouraging collaboration with Wikipedia and libraries. And it's really well worth following what she's done. And I highly recommend anyone considering working with Wikipedia to find out from Marilee what's worked and what hasn't. She's really been a leader in this area and done some tremendously impressive work. The other thing that I was really impressed with in this particular proposal, and this may sound a little bit odd, but if you look at the third audience, that is really comprehensive. And I was especially impressed with the reference to security staff because I've had experiences with this, and especially since, with Sarah and I work in a federal government, we know all about security these days. That getting the security staff involved up front if you're having a weekend event in a library is just really a well thought out idea. I mean, it just shows that the person really knows what's going on. So that's a good example of looking at all aspects of a project and understanding what the implications are. The other thing that came to mind as we were thinking about this one is that it could be considered a one-off event, that essentially that there's going to be an engagement with Wikipedia contributors, and it could happen, and that there would be these products that came out of it, the better entries in Wikipedia using library resources, and that could be done. But it might also be useful to think about and have some kind of evaluation process in place to determine whether a longer-term relationship with the Wikipedia community is worth their while. Do they want to continue working with this group? Do they want to expand this group specifically because perhaps of the content? Could they do it in other locations or other, even in other regions of the country or the world? It's a possibility. The other way to look at it is that if the goal is not so much just working with Wikipedia, but increasing the use and value of the library's resources, then perhaps the overall goal is to learn more about engaging users and learning about crowdsourcing, with Wikipedia is just one of the potential tools to support that kind of engagement. And I always think it's useful to have more than one tool in the toolbox. So even as a prototype, if the assessment and the evaluation of this project could include that larger consideration, the ways of using crowdsourcing, then I think that that should be an interesting and worthwhile lead to follow up on. And by no coincidence, the IMLS, along with the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Sloan Foundation, have supported a particular effort to better understand crowdsourcing and what's been working, what techniques are useful, what models are valuable, what expertise, capacity libraries, archives, and museums need to do crowdsourcing. And that work has been done, or is being done, I should say, by Mary Flanagan from Dartmouth College. And if you go to crowdconsortium.org on the web, you'll find out a lot more about it. It's a very, very, I think, well thought out project, and obviously with funding from 3 different sources, I think it shows not only just the significance of the topic, but the credibility of the work that they're doing. So I'll turn it over to you, Mary Ellen.
Thanks, Bob. A couple more questions just came in. Trying to give a little bit more detail, but Dottie wanted to know whether funders would ever offer a grant for training. I don't know if she has some specific ideas in mind, and I asked her for a little bit more information, haven't heard yet. While you're thinking about that, Terry Marsh was asking about long-term preservation accessibility of digitized material, but technology is moving so fast. How do we find the right expertise to manage that aspect of it? Oh, and Dottie responded, training in archiving and digital archiving for people that are untrained.
There has been some fun. I mean, we have a program called the Laura Bush 21st Century Program that supports training for library professionals. So that's a funding source for training programs and continuing education, and actually it's the source of the funding for this particular LAM coalition. So that's how this project is being funded. I believe AASLH has had and it may be online, I think they're talking about updating it, a online course and set of resources for training for archives for non-professionals. So it'd be worth checking with the AASLH website and organization to see if that's available and if it's updated. It was done, I think, originally with a National Historic Publications and Records Commission grant several years ago. SAA, the Society of American Archivists, also has a variety of different training options and workshops for archivists and for archival topics. So it would be worthwhile looking at the Society of American Archivists website as well.
And Bob, if I could just interrupt, remember we're speaking to 3 sectors here, so I'm tripping over the AASLH. So could you
okay,
just say what
that's
that
one
is
of our
for everybody,
sponsors, American Association of State and Local History. Sorry about that.
Thank you.
And Society of American Archivists. So thank you, Mary Ellen, for reminding me. That was something we heard in the first webinar too.
No jargon.
No jargon. No jargon and no acronym. So I apologize. Question about digital preservation. It's not easy. In fact, if you noticed just recently, there was an article by Vince Cerf from Google pointing out that digital preservation is a tremendously under-supported, under-neglected activity, and that we stand in danger of having, most of the last few decades become a black hole of memory, I think is the term he used. I wouldn't necessarily consider it to be that abysmal a record, but it's undoubtedly true that there's an enormous amount of content in digital format that hasn't been adequately stored or preserved. Some ways that people are addressing it, I know that the Library of Congress's DEPO program and its Digital Preservation Outreach and Education has set up some very straightforward introductory lessons and practical proposals for managing digital content. So again, that's Library of Congress's DEPO program, Digital Preservation Outreach and Education. Find a lot of information there on that website about rather simple steps you can take. If I might add, though, many of us are in the business or looking to create digital content, we can certainly make things easier by taking a do-no-harm approach, doing the work up front to make sure that the material that we create, whether it's born digital or digitized, is going to be preservable. The right formats, the right choices about metadata, and then right choices about storage media. So to a certain extent, our professions have been guilty ourselves. Any of us who could open a desk drawer and find floppy disks or even at this point CD-ROM done with a word processing application that disappeared a decade ago, which is more or less like when the dinosaurs roamed in computer terms, know that we've all been guilty of this. So there's a lot to do, but I think there's some very practical opportunities out there to help us do better.
That's great, Bob. And the participants, I'd like to give a shout out to them because they've been actively posting links to all kinds of resources on digitization training and things that people can use. And even when, a positive approach, I think it was Katie who mentioned that when one of your project leaders leaves unexpectedly, it can be an opportunity to address the things that maybe weren't going quite the way you wanted to. So in every dark cloud, there can be a silver lining.
Right.
Always good to have an optimist on the webinar, that's for sure.
Exactly.
I think that's great. Yeah, so we tend to run the pessimism ourselves, Sarah and I, so having a little counterbalance is really, really good. Thank you. So were there other questions? Should we move on to the next, do you think, Mary Ellen?
I think we're ready to move on.
Okay. So this is a proposal that came in from the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. And the description of the project: in honor of Mississippi's bicentennial, the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, Archives and Record Services Division, in partnership with local colleges, libraries, and historical societies, will promote the state's history, culture, diversity, people, and geography by emphasizing collection materials, that celebrate Mississippi's past and present achievements. And this will be done through a series of outreach programs that allow partnering organizations to create a social and digital space to highlight and access historical collections around the state. So I thought that was an admirably concise and to a certain extent ambitious, but certainly doable and practical description of the project. And the audiences were listed as students, particularly high school and college, historical folks, individuals who frequent historical societies, libraries, and museums, and partnering institutions. And a couple of suggestions that we made. It is, as we said, a somewhat ambitious topic, so one of the things we suggested was looking at some perhaps low-cost ways to get started that would give the project time and opportunity to develop some momentum, to find some partners, and ideally demonstrate some successes and results that will help them raise more funds. So a lot of these things can be developed and started on a smaller scale, and then as experience and expertise and partnership and funds increase, then they can be increased in scope and scale accordingly. So one thing we recommended, especially for an online exhibits tool, which is relatively straightforward and relatively well thought out, is Omeka, O-M-E-K-A, which is a tool for online exhibits that was developed by their Center for History and New Media at George Mason. And it is available as both a standalone and as a hosted web application. IMLS has been one of the funders. I believe a variety of different funding sources have helped it move along, but it's extremely easy to use. It's relatively easily available, depending on whether you're going to host it yourself or have a hosted version of it. But it would certainly allow for theme-based digital presentations that could point to collections or curriculum material for further use. And as I said, it's open source. It's pretty well tested. I'm certain that they could find people close by who could help them set it up. The other thing we talked about was the partnership aspect. And one of the things that we suggested was that they kind of change the order of their audiences. The third audience, the partnering institutions, in some ways seem to us to be the more important one or the most important one, because if they're especially looking to help other organizations celebrate the bicentennial or celebrate their collections or make connections on a local level with high school students or local colleges, then they're, in a sense, looking at a kind of train-the-trainer approach where what they really need on a critical basis is to set up a framework for collaboration and to find those collaborators. So unless they really want to focus on something that's online and delivered by the Mississippi Department of Archives and History primarily, then they're reaching their audiences through their partners. And so that's something that we recommended, testing projects with them, working with the partners in focus groups, et cetera, and especially emphasizing the communication and outreach aspect of this, because a statewide collaboration with a wide variety of institutions really demands a lot of support at the planning stage. You can't create a project and then hope somebody's going to buy into it down the line. You really want them engaged in developing the proposal. So get them involved at the design phase, keep them involved, give them some options, find out what they need, provide things that they can't, and then find out what complementary resources and activities they in turn can provide.
If you're also starting with new partners or trying to form this kind of a large network, what Bob said before about starting small can also be a huge benefit. It can build trust between partners if you have a bunch of small successes instead of going for the big goal at the outset and then having a failure. So working small in the beginning helps you to learn each other's communication styles and to kind of garner that trust and support within each other.
Thank you. So, Mary Ellen, questions? We see this Q&A, or the chat box kind of flashes past our eyes before we can actually read anything.
Yeah, there is one question. Lori had a question about when you're building a historical digital collection, is documenting permissions a concern, and should that explicitly be built into a work plan?
Yeah, in the best of all worlds, yes, because you're looking at a situation where content online can be used, borrowed, stolen, you name it, and you're basically putting it out there for other people to take advantage of. And if you do not understand the use and intellectual property rights, then you're putting yourself and your institution in kind of a bad way. The one thing I would add, though, is that we tend to overestimate, all of us, the challenges there, and that a number of ways you can protect yourself, even if you haven't really explored the intellectual property rights up front, is a takedown notice. I mean, if you've already got the material digitized, you've already got it out there, but you don't really necessarily understand all the rights-related issues, make sure there's some kind of notice there to people that says, if you claim any intellectual property rights, let us know and we'll take the stuff down. That very often is enough to satisfy any complaint, and certainly will do a great deal to keep you out of the courts. The other thing, that to keep in mind is the threat of litigation is much lower than we tend to think. I'm not a lawyer, take this with a grain of salt, but essentially, as long as you're not dealing with large corporations who have a vested interest in protecting intellectual property at any price, then what you're really looking at is something that can be handled relatively simply, because the threat of litigation is not really all that serious unless there's a demonstration of economic damage. So I'm wandering into areas that I probably shouldn't at this point, but I was just saying you can be very realistic about the intellectual property rights issues, but the safest thing, the best thing, the smartest thing absolutely is to have up front some clear understanding of the rights that are being transferred or being given in any type of collecting activity, whether it's digital or traditional, right up front.
And then just two follow-up questions to that. Could you be a little bit more explicit about what you mean when you say takedown notice?
Oh, a takedown notice is essentially something on your website that says if there's anything you hear, anything you see, whether it's a document or a photograph, a video, whatever, any kind of content that in which you have an intellectual property right, and you think we've infringed on that, tell us, and we'll take it down. You'll remove it from the site.
That's great. And I see people have asked for examples. So if any of you have takedown notices on your website and you could post a link to them in the chat box, I know the questioners would find that helpful. And the next question is really getting you into your copyright attorney hat here, Bob. Yeah, I know. They want to know whether, Renee wants to know whether non-commercial use in an educational sense protects you overall in using materials in an exhibition.
I would say, I'm not an attorney, and I've probably gone too far out of my area of expertise at this point. But I would say if you have any doubts, consult an attorney. I certainly have experience at the Minnesota Historical Society when we were there. We did, in conjunction with a baseball exhibit, used an image of someone, and it was a non-commercial activity and a non-commercial organization, a nonprofit, but we still had to take down that image. So I won't go into all the details, but I've certainly had experiences where even in a non-commercial use, you've had to respect people's property rights.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And HRL participates in the Library Copyright Alliance, and we have many conversations with a copyright attorney trying to file briefs and things to support fair use. And I think we encourage everyone to try and push the fair use for educational purposes, but it isn't necessarily, and I'm not a copyright attorney either, but it's not necessarily a guarantee. And for those of you at institutions that have attorneys, I think it's good to consult with them, although it's our experience that they tend to be maybe more conservative around fair use than we would like them to be. So I think the takedown notice is a great workaround for that, because it does say you're willing to take things down if you've unintentionally stepped on somebody's IP rights. Yeah,
absolutely. And of course, then you have to act on it. So, be prepared for that. And so some great examples are coming up. So I think that's great, very helpful. So our next one and last one comes from the Cleveland Museum of Art. And I confess this was really one of our favorites because we really liked this one. And the project is, description is, art museums seek to inspire, to spark imagination, to encourage questions, yet the answers aren't always as readily available. The aim of this project is to harness the curiosity of art museum visitors by creating a digital Ask an Expert service that provides the means to interact publicly yet anonymously with museum experts, to seek answers to questions where and when inspiration hits, and to provide a platform for the voice of all museum visitors. And then the audiences were on-site museum visitors, virtual researchers, and visitors to the museum's website, and upper management in the departments of design, information technology, education, and development. And this seemed like a really fantastic idea because it recognizes the fact that, you know, we're in a world where most people are walking around with a smartphone, and in a world where they're increasingly expecting to have answers to their questions delivered pretty quickly, and when the question comes to them and not down the line. And, you know, the challenges, as I think this proposal made very clear, is that in many cases, you know, traditional library and archives and museums are not ready to meet those needs. And so looking at different ways to address that would be, I think, extraordinarily valuable. And so you know, we're happy to engage in a kind of conversation about this. And one of the things that we suggested was really, can you keep the technology simple in the sense that if there's not a need to develop a new app, if it's something that could be done with Twitter, something that could take advantage of an application or software that users already have and are familiar with, then the barrier to use and the barrier to implementation goes down pretty quickly. You're not informing anybody about here's an app you have to download, here's something you have to learn about your app. They're just able to do something that they can do in the course of ordinary life and ordinary routine. That's also lower investment on the museum or the library, the archive, whoever is implementing this. They're not in application development. They're in the business of providing subject matter expertise, which is what they know best. So that's one thing to really consider is how to keep it simple and how to lower the burdens and barriers on both sides of the equation, users and providers. And the other thing is really the ability to provide quick service. I mean, that's something that maybe could be tested within some sort of prototype. It may allow for some limits on the service, that is focusing on only some exhibits, some objects, so as to narrow the range of questions and allow for some prepackaged answers. But I think there's a number of ways to test this. So overall, the idea is really, really exciting. And in the conversation that followed with the Cleveland Museum of Art staff, the one thing that they pointed out, and I think is really quite interesting, and I'll quote from this, is one of the elements we want to explore is the fact that our previous experiment with this resulted in what we perceived as an increased willingness to ask questions publicly after seeing questions and answers that others ask. So they want to keep a record and basically make the questions and answers available publicly, and it could be done on screens in the museum itself. It certainly could be done on the web. And people, as they say, shed their inhibition about asking a stupid, in quotes, question about art once they saw the range of questions and answers that others had on their minds. So this really seems as a way both to engage the audience and to deepen that engagement, conceivably with some relatively simple tools that builds on the expertise that's already available in the staff. So we thought this was pretty impressive. Mary Ellen?
We don't have any questions at the moment, and I know we're down to our last 5 minutes, so perhaps we should just open it up and see if there's any questions of a general nature for anybody. Okay.
Yeah, that would be great. Let me just move that forward. Here's us. I should say at this point, we probably are not going to be able to answer or respond to any more worksheets. Though certainly we hope to have other webinars and opportunities in the future to work with you. certainly interested in suggestions about further types of projects that we could use for continuing education and further things we could do with our coalition. Here's a question that I see: will we be allowed to view any of the other project ideas? I'd have to kind of verify that with everybody. So maybe not. We'll find out. Will there be another webinar from this coalition? I certainly hope so. And we have a meeting next month where we'll be talking about next steps for the coalition. And what I hope is that the participation and interest shown in this set of webinars will be compelling argument for more work and more efforts. Are all projects digital? We're looking at a brick printing project. No, not all projects. No, all projects were not digital, but technology usually came up in most of them. That volunteer project, for example, was not digital, but technology did play a role in a lot of activities. Can you expand for 1 minute or less on how the departments of the museum, I assume, are audience? Do they have a need to go get out info to the public? My understanding of that was essentially that the departments were very interested in engagement with the public, and that in essence, the library and archives staff that were willing to run this project would be using the ideas and expertise of other departments like curatorial staff within the organization as resources, but also as help and suggestions in guiding and developing the whole project as a whole.
I think it also brings up a good point that project planning isn't just an outward activity. You can have project management on an internal level with audiences that are within your own institution.
Yeah, absolutely. And we saw a few proposals like that where the main idea was to increase efficiency either through records management plans or digitization plans to meet the needs of the organization itself and not necessarily an external constituency at all.
Well, I'm looking at the clock and it's 1:58 or 1:59, depending on whether I leave my phone or my computer. So I'd like to interrupt to just thank Bob and Sarah for all of your helpful presentations and your responses. I know I've had some more ideas about how I might want to develop my next project proposal. And I'd like to thank all of you who attended. And I saw a number of comments from people who appreciated having the cross-sector audience and found it of interest and worth continuing. So I'd like to encourage each of you to please fill out the evaluation. You'll get a link as you leave the room, and we really will be reading your comments. As Bob said, we're meeting in the next week and next month, and we are going to be looking at what we can learn from this pilot project, and your comments will be reviewed and will really inform our next steps in identifying best practices for developing sustainable cross-sector learning events. So thank you all very much, and good luck with your project planning.
Thank you, Mary Ellen.
Thank you.